The psychology of invisible influence. Let them think it was their idea. Introduction. Everything you've been taught about persuasion is wrong. I need you to read that sentence again, because this might be the most important realization you have today. Everything you learned about how to convince people, how to change minds, how to win arguments, all of it is backwards. The strategies you've been using, the ones that seemed logical and reasonable, are actually pushing people further away from your ideas instead of bringing them closer. And the worst part is that the harder you try using those old methods, the more resistance you create. This isn't just my opinion or some motivational philosophy dressed up as wisdom. This is neuroscience. Once you understand what's really happening inside the brain when you try to convince someone of something, you'll never approach a conversation the same way again. The patterns you've relied on for years will suddenly look less like communication and more like warfare, and you'll see exactly why they've been failing you. Think about the last time you tried to persuade someone of something you knew was right. Maybe it was your boss who couldn't see the value in your proposal, your spouse who disagreed with a major decision, your colleague who refused to consider a better approach, or your teenager who seemed determined to make the wrong choice. You had facts on your side. You had logic. You had irrefutable proof that your idea was the best path forward. So you presented your case calmly, clearly, confidently, laying out each point like a lawyer building an airtight argument. And they rejected it anyway. Not because your argument was weak or your evidence was insufficient. Not because you didn't explain it well enough or failed to make your case. They rejected it because of how the human brain is wired to respond to pressure. And the method you used, direct persuasion, triggered an automatic defense mechanism that made it nearly impossible for them to agree with you, even if somewhere deep down they knew you were right. You've been set up to fail from the beginning, and it's not your fault. Nobody taught you how influence actually works. We need to talk about the 3 biggest lies you've been told about influence, because these aren't small misconceptions or minor misunderstandings. These are fundamental errors in how we think about communication, and they've been sabotaging your relationships, your career, and your leadership for years. Once we expose these myths and replace them with the truth, you'll see exactly why your past attempts at persuasion have failed and what you need to do instead. The first lie is that facts and logic convince people. This is what they taught you in school, isn't it? Build a logical argument. Present your evidence step by step. If your reasoning is sound and your facts are solid, people will see the truth and change their minds accordingly. It's clean. It's rational. It's how intelligent people are supposed to make decisions. And it's completely wrong. The reality is that facts don't change minds. They activate defense systems. When you present someone with evidence that contradicts their existing beliefs or challenges their current position, their brain doesn't process it as helpful information that deserves consideration. Instead, it processes your facts as a threat to their autonomy and their sense of being right. The amygdala lights up like a warning signal. Cortisol floods through their system, and suddenly, the person you're trying to help goes into fight or flight mode, treating your well-intentioned argument like an attack that needs to be defended against. You're not having a productive conversation anymore. You're in a battle, and they will defend their position with everything they have, not because they're inherently stubborn or closed-minded, but because their brain has decided that you are attacking their autonomy, their identity, their right to think for themselves. Research from Yale, Stanford, and dozens of neuroscience labs around the world has confirmed this pattern over and over again. When people are confronted with facts that challenge their worldview or contradict what they currently believe, the logical part of their brain shuts down while the emotional part takes over. and emotion wins every single time, no matter how good your facts are. This is why political debates never change anyone's mind, no matter how skilled the debaters are. This is why presenting data to a skeptical client often makes them more skeptical instead of less. This is why your teenager rolls their eyes when you explain, for the 10th time, why their decision is a bad idea. You're not failing to convince them because you lack the right arguments. You're biologically programming them to resist you by using the wrong approach. The second lie is that being direct is the most honest and effective way to communicate what you want. You've been told that directness is a virtue, something that mature and confident people practice. Say what you mean. Don't beat around the bush. Be straightforward and clear. People respect honesty and appreciate when you get to the point without wasting time. And they do appreciate honesty, but there's a critical problem with this advice. Directness in persuasion doesn't feel like honesty to the person on the receiving end. It feels like pressure. And pressure creates enemies instead of allies. When you say, "You should do this," or "You need to change that," or "Here's what you have to understand," what the other person hears underneath those words is, "I don't trust your judgment." You might think you're being helpful and clear. They hear an attempt to control them. You think you're being honest and straightforward. They feel like you're treating them like they're incapable of figuring things out on their own. The human brain is wired to protect autonomy above almost everything else. We would rather make the wrong choice and feel free than make the right choice and feel controlled by someone else's agenda. This is why teenagers rebel against perfectly reasonable advice from their parents. This is why employees resist micromanagement, even when the manager's suggestions are technically correct. This is why your spouse shuts down emotionally when you tell them what to do, even when you're objectively right about the situation. Being direct doesn't make you honest. It makes you sound like someone trying to take away their freedom to choose. The third lie, and perhaps the most dangerous one of all, is that good ideas sell themselves. You've been told that if your idea is good enough, smart enough, valuable enough, people will naturally recognize its worth and adopt it. Just present it clearly, and the strength of the concept will do the work for you. Quality speaks for itself, right? Except it doesn't. History is absolutely littered with brilliant ideas that were ignored, dismissed, mocked, or outright rejected. Not because they were bad ideas, but because they were presented in ways that triggered resistance instead of enthusiasm. Meanwhile, average ideas with great marketing and strategic presentation win every time. The uncomfortable truth is that presentation matters more than content when it comes to influence. How you deliver an idea, how you frame it, how you guide someone to discover it, determines whether it gets accepted far more than the actual quality of the idea itself. This is why mediocre products with brilliant advertising campaigns dominate markets. This is why average leaders with strong communication skills rise faster in organizations than brilliant tacticians who can't influence a room. This is why your best ideas die in presentations while someone else's half-baked concepts get adopted with enthusiasm. Your idea doesn't speak for itself. You have to speak for it. And if you don't know how to plant it in someone's mind in a way that makes them think they came up with it themselves, your idea will die no matter how good it is. So if facts don't work the way we thought, if directness backfires instead of helping, and if good ideas need strategic delivery to survive, what are you supposed to do? The answer is simpler than you think, but it requires you to completely change your approach. You need to stop trying to convince people of anything. Instead, you need to learn how to guide their thoughts so invisibly, so skillfully, that they arrive at the conclusion you wanted all along and believe it was their own discovery the entire time. This is called invisible influence. And it's the most powerful communication skill you will ever develop in your lifetime. Invisible influence is not manipulation in the dark, unethical sense of that word. It's not lying to people or tricking them into doing something against their will or their best interests. It's not about controlling anyone. What it is the art of leading someone to a conclusion without triggering their psychological defenses. It's about making them feel completely autonomous while you subtly shape the environment, the questions, the frame, and the context in ways that make the path forward obvious to them. When someone thinks an idea was theirs from the beginning, they don't resist it. They champion it with passion. They defend it against criticism. They take full ownership of it and feel proud of having thought of it. And that's exactly what you want. Because a person defending their own idea is 1,000 times more powerful than a person reluctantly following someone else's instructions. This is how the best leaders in the world operate on a daily basis. They don't command people and expect obedience. They guide thinking and create conditions where people want to follow. This is how top negotiators close deals that seem impossible to everyone watching. They don't push harder and harder until someone breaks. They create situations where the other side feels like they're winning even as they agree to your terms. This is how great parents raise independent thinkers instead of obedient children. They don't lecture and demand compliance. They ask the right questions and let their kids discover the answers that will serve them for life. And this is exactly what you're going to learn how to do in this book. Over the next 9 chapters, you're going to discover the exact psychology behind invisible influence and learn the specific techniques that make it work in any situation you face. Each chapter will break down one critical element of influence that you can start using immediately. Whether you're leading a team, negotiating a deal, resolving a conflict, or simply trying to get your family on board with an important decision. You'll learn why resistance happens in the first place and how to disarm it before it starts. You'll discover how to use questions instead of statements to guide thinking. You'll master the art of planting ideas so subtly that people forget where they first heard them. You'll understand how to reframe any situation to change how people see it. And you'll learn how to combine all these techniques into a seamless approach that makes your influence feel completely natural. By the time you finish this book, you won't need to argue with anyone ever again. You won't need to. People will come to your conclusions on their own. Thank you for helping them think it through and move forward with enthusiasm instead of resistance. Stop convincing. Start guiding. Chapter 1. Why everyone resists you. Every time you try to convince someone of something, you lose them a little bit more. Read that again. Because most people spend their entire lives doing the exact opposite of what actually works. They think that building a stronger argument, gathering more evidence, explaining their position more clearly, will eventually break through and change someone's mind. But what they're actually doing is creating an enemy where there didn't need to be one. They're activating a defense system inside the other person's brain that makes agreement nearly impossible, no matter how right they are or how good their argument sounds. You've experienced this yourself, probably more times than you can count. You present a logical case to someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a business proposal your boss should obviously approve, a parenting decision your spouse should clearly agree with, or a life choice your adult child should definitely reconsider. You lay out your reasoning step by step. You address potential objections before they even come up. You keep your tone calm and your facts straight. And then you watch as the person you're trying to help digs in their heels and refuses to budge, even when they can't come up with a good counter-argument. What just happened? Did you fail to make your case strongly enough? Did you miss some crucial piece of evidence that would have sealed the deal? Are they just being stubborn and irrational for no reason? None of those things. What happened is that you triggered something called psychological reactance. And once that system activates, logic and facts become completely irrelevant to the conversation. Psychological reactance is one of the most powerful and least understood forces in human communication. It's a defense mechanism built into the brain that activates the moment someone perceives a threat to their freedom to choose. And the moment you start trying to convince someone of something, especially if they can sense that you really want them to agree with you, their brain doesn't process your words as helpful information. It processes them as an attempt to control, to manipulate, to take away their autonomy. And the brain will do almost anything to protect that sense of freedom. This isn't conscious or deliberate. The person you're talking to doesn't sit there thinking, "This person is trying to control me, so I'm going to resist them on purpose just to prove a point." It happens at a level far below conscious awareness. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threats, starts firing signals. Cortisol and adrenaline start flowing through their system. The logical, rational part of their brain that could actually evaluate your argument starts shutting down, while the emotional, defensive part takes over. And suddenly, instead of listening to your words and weighing their merit, they're in fight-or-flight mode, treating your reasonable suggestion like an attack that needs to be defended against. Think about the last time someone tried to convince you of something you weren't initially inclined to believe. Maybe it was a political argument, a debate about parenting styles, or a discussion about how you should be living your life. Even if the person was being perfectly polite and presenting reasonable points, you probably felt something tighten in your chest. You probably started thinking of counter-arguments before they even finished talking. You might have felt yourself getting defensive, maybe even angry, even though nothing about the situation objectively warranted that emotional response. That was psychological reactance. Your brain decided that this person was trying to limit your freedom to think for yourself, and it immediately went into defense mode to protect that freedom. And once that happens, it doesn't matter how good their argument is. You're not listening anymore. You're defending. This is why facts and logic by themselves almost never change anyone's mind about anything that matters to them. When you present someone with information that contradicts what they currently believe, especially if you present it in a way that makes it clear you expect them to change their mind, you're not giving them helpful data. You're attacking their autonomy, and they will defend their current position with everything they have. Not because the position is necessarily right, but because accepting your position would feel like surrendering control to you. Research from some of the top psychology and neuroscience labs in the world has confirmed this pattern again and again. Studies at Yale found that when people are presented with facts that contradict their political beliefs, the part of their brain responsible for logical reasoning literally shuts down, while the part responsible for emotional response and identity protection lights up like fireworks. Stanford researchers discovered that the more evidence you give someone against their position, the more strongly they cling to that position, a phenomenon they called the backfire effect. The evidence doesn't weaken their belief. It strengthens it, because now they're not just defending an idea, they're defending themselves. This is why political debates accomplish nothing except making both sides more entrenched in their existing positions. This is why presenting your teenage child with statistics about the dangers of their behavior makes them more likely to engage in that behavior, not less. This is why showing your skeptical client more and more data about why your solution is the right one often makes them less likely to buy, not more. You're not overcoming their resistance. You're creating it. And the worst part is that the harder you push, the stronger the resistance becomes. Every additional fact you present is another piece of evidence to their subconscious mind that you're trying to control them. Every additional argument is another reason to dig in and defend their current position. You think you're building a stronger case. They think you're becoming more aggressive and threatening. And the gap between you grows wider with every word you speak. But there's something even more frustrating about psychological reactance that most people never realize. It doesn't just make people resist your ideas. It makes them actively champion the opposite of what you want, even if that opposite position doesn't actually serve them well. This is why teenagers whose parents strongly forbid something often become obsessed with doing exactly that thing. This is why employees who feel micromanaged become less productive instead of more. This is why your spouse might reject a perfectly good suggestion simply because of how strongly you're pushing for it. The brain doesn't just want to protect its freedom to choose. It wants to prove that it still has that freedom by choosing the opposite of what you're suggesting. There's a famous study that illustrates this perfectly. Researchers set up a booth offering free cookies to people walking by. In one condition, they simply offered the cookies with a sign that said, "Free cookies, take one." In another condition, they put up a sign that said, "Please limit yourself to one cookie per person." Guess which condition resulted in people taking more cookies? The second one. The moment people felt like their freedom to take as many cookies as they wanted was being limited. Even by a polite request, they took more cookies just to assert their autonomy. Not because they wanted more cookies, because they wanted to prove they were still free to choose. This is what's happening in your conversations when you try to convince people. You might think you're being helpful and persuasive. They're hearing "do what I say" underneath your words, and their brain is responding with, "I'll show you that you can't control me, even if it means making a choice that hurts them." So what's the alternative? If trying to convince people activates their defense systems and makes them resist you, what are you supposed to do when you genuinely need someone to see things differently? You stop trying to convince them of anything. You stop presenting arguments and evidence and logical reasoning. You stop trying to win debates. And you start doing something completely different. You start creating conditions where they discover the conclusion on their own without ever feeling like you pushed them there. When someone arrives at a conclusion themselves, psychological reactance doesn't activate. Their brain doesn't perceive a threat to autonomy because they feel like they made the decision freely. There's no one to resist because, as far as they can tell, the idea was theirs all along. And once they believe that, they don't just accept the idea. They own it. They defend it. They become its champion, often more strongly than you ever would have been if you'd successfully convinced them through argument. This is the fundamental difference between convincing and influencing. Convincing is about winning an argument, overpowering resistance, getting someone to admit you were right and they were wrong. Influence is about guiding thinking so invisibly that resistance never forms in the first place. Convincing creates enemies. Influence creates allies who think they were always on your side. Think about the people in your life who have the most influence over you. Not the people who argue with you or try to change your mind through debate, but the people whose opinions you genuinely value and whose suggestions you actually follow. Chances are, these people rarely try to convince you of anything directly. Instead, they ask questions that make you think. They share experiences without pushing you to draw specific conclusions from them. They create space for you to figure things out while subtly guiding the direction of your thinking. And you trust them because you never feel controlled by them. That's what you're going to learn to do. Not through manipulation or deception, but through understanding how the brain actually works and aligning your communication with that reality instead of fighting against it. In the next chapter, we're going to dive deeper into the brain's defense system and understand exactly what's happening neurologically when someone resists you. Because once you understand the mechanism, you can learn to bypass it completely. But for now, I want you to start paying attention to something specific in your daily life. Notice every time you feel the urge to convince someone of something. Notice the moment you start building an argument in your head about why they should agree with you. Notice when you present evidence or facts to support your position. And then notice their reaction. Do they lean in with interest and openness? Or do they pull back and start defending their current position? Do they ask curious questions? Or do they immediately start explaining why you're wrong? If you're seeing resistance, it's not because your argument is weak. It's because you triggered their defense system. And that means everything you say after that moment is making things worse, not better, no matter how logical and correct you are. The solution isn't to argue harder. It's to stop arguing entirely and start guiding instead. And that journey starts with recognizing the pattern you've been stuck in for years. Chapter 2. The Brain's Defense System. Your brain has a security system designed to protect you from threats. And every time someone tries to convince you of something, that system treats their words like an intruder trying to break into your house. Most people walk through life completely unaware that this defense mechanism even exists. They think that when someone disagrees with them or rejects their perfectly reasonable suggestion, it's because the other person is being stubborn, irrational, or deliberately difficult. But the truth is far more interesting and far more useful once you understand it. The resistance you're experiencing isn't personal. It's biological. It's an automatic response that happens at a neurological level before the person you're talking to even has a chance to consciously think about what you're saying. Understanding this changes everything about how you communicate. Because once you know what triggers the alarm system, you can learn to approach conversations in ways that bypass it entirely. And when that defense system never activates, people are able to actually hear what you're saying and consider it on its merits, instead of immediately rejecting it to protect their autonomy. So what exactly is happening inside someone's brain when you start trying to persuade them? The moment your words or tone suggest that you want them to change their mind or adopt your position, several things happen simultaneously in different parts of their brain. The amygdala, which is responsible for detecting potential threats to survival and well-being, starts firing warning signals. It's asking a very specific question that has nothing to do with the logic of your argument and everything to do with power dynamics. The question is this person trying to control me? If the answer is yes, or even if the answer is maybe, the amygdala triggers a stress response. Cortisol and adrenaline start flowing through their system. Their heart rate increases slightly. Their breathing becomes shallower. And most importantly for your conversation, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logical reasoning and rational decision-making, starts to shut down while the limbic system, the emotional and reactive part of the brain, takes over. This is the exact same biological response their ancestors experienced when facing a physical threat from a predator or an enemy tribe. The body is preparing for fight or flight, prioritizing immediate survival over careful analysis. And in this state, your facts and logic become completely irrelevant, because they're not being processed by the part of the brain that can evaluate them rationally. They're being filtered through the emotional brain that's asking, how do I defend myself from this threat? Now I know what you might be thinking. A conversation isn't a physical threat. There's no actual danger. Why would the brain react this way to someone simply presenting a different viewpoint? Because for millions of years of human evolution, being controlled by others actually was a survival threat. Being forced to do what another person wanted, having your autonomy taken away, being manipulated into decisions that weren't in your best interest. These things could literally get you killed or severely harm your chances of survival and reproduction. So the brain evolved incredibly sensitive mechanisms for detecting when someone might be trying to control or manipulate you. And it learned to treat those situations with the same urgency as physical danger. Your brain doesn't distinguish between, "This person is trying to convince me their business idea is better," and "This person is trying to take away my freedom." Both situations trigger the same defense response, because at a neurological level, they look identical. Someone is attempting to override your judgment and get you to do what they want instead of what you want, and your survival brain says, absolutely not. This is why people can become surprisingly emotional and defensive during debates that seem to be about abstract ideas or logical propositions. You're not just disagreeing with their opinion. You're triggering an ancient defense mechanism that treats your disagreement as an attempt to dominate them. And they will fight back with everything they have. Not because they're irrational, but because their brain is trying to protect them from what it perceives as a threat to their autonomy and survival. There are 3 specific triggers that almost always activate this defense system, and most people unknowingly hit all 3 of them when they're trying to convince someone of something. The first trigger is direct statements that tell someone what they should do or think. Phrases like, "You should," "You need to," "You have to," or "the right thing to do" immediately signal to the brain that someone is attempting to override its authority. Even if you're trying to be helpful, even if your suggestion is objectively good advice, these phrases activate the same defensive response as if you'd said, "I know better than you, so stop thinking for yourself and do what I say." Think about how you feel when someone tells you what you should do, especially about something you haven't asked for advice about. Maybe it's a family member commenting on how you should be raising your kids, a colleague explaining how you should be doing your job, or a friend suggesting how you should handle your relationship. Even if you know intellectually that they're trying to help and might even be right, something in you bristles at the suggestion. You might not say it out loud, but you think, "They don't get to tell me what to do." That's the defense system activating. The second trigger is negating or contradicting someone's current position. When you say things like, "You're wrong about that," "That's not true," or "Actually, what really happened was," you're not just offering a different perspective. You're attacking their judgment and their right to see things their own way. The brain hears, "Your perception of reality is incorrect and needs to be replaced with mine," and it immediately moves to defend not just the specific belief you're challenging, but their entire sense of being a capable, intelligent person who can trust their own thinking. This is why correcting people, even when you're factually correct, so often backfires and makes them more convinced of their wrong belief instead of less. You're not giving them better information. You're threatening their sense of competence and autonomy. And they would rather be wrong and feel autonomous than be right and feel controlled by you. The third trigger, and this one catches people by surprise, is urgency or pressure to decide quickly. When you say things like, "I need an answer today," "Time is running out," or "This opportunity won't last," you're essentially telling someone that they need to override their natural decision-making process and make a choice on your timeline instead of theirs. The brain interprets this as a manipulation tactic, which it often is, and immediately becomes more skeptical and resistant. Real estate agents and car salespeople use this tactic constantly, creating artificial scarcity and deadline pressure to force decisions. And it works sometimes on people who aren't paying attention to their own reactions. But it always creates resistance, even when the person eventually buys. They walk away feeling like they were pushed into something. And that feeling of being manipulated makes them less likely to trust you in the future, and more likely to experience buyer's remorse. Now, the really fascinating part is that all 3 of these triggers can be communicated non-verbally, through tone and body language, even when your actual words seem neutral. You can say, "What do you think about this idea?" in a way that clearly communicates, "I expect you to agree with me." And the brain will pick up on that expectation and resist it. You can present information while your posture and facial expressions scream, "I'm right, and you need to admit it." And the person will react defensively to your nonverbal communication, even if they can't consciously articulate why they suddenly feel resistant. This is why some people seem to create resistance everywhere they go, even when they think they're being perfectly reasonable. Their words might be fine, but their energy, their tone, their body language is constantly broadcasting, "Do what I want," or "My way is better than yours." And people's defense systems are constantly activating in response. So if all of these things trigger defensive reactions and make persuasion impossible, what's the alternative? How are you supposed to guide someone toward a better decision without activating their security system? The answer is something I call the disarm first approach. Instead of starting with your position or your argument or what you want them to do, you start by explicitly removing any perceived threat to their autonomy. You signal clearly, both with your words and your tone, that you're not here to control them, pressure them, or override their judgment. There are several ways to do this effectively, and they all work because they address the brain's security system directly instead of trying to sneak past it. The first technique is acknowledging their autonomy explicitly before you offer any input. Phrases like, "This is completely your decision," "I might be wrong about this," or "What do you think?" before sharing your perspective tells their brain, "I'm not trying to control you. Your judgment is respected here." This simple act of verbal disarmament lowers their defenses enough that they can actually hear what you say next, instead of immediately preparing counterarguments. I know this might sound weak or uncertain to you, especially if you're used to being direct and confident in your communication. You might worry that saying, "I might be wrong," undermines your credibility or makes people take you less seriously. But the opposite is true. People trust and respect those who make space for other perspectives far more than they trust people who present themselves as having all the answers. And more importantly, they actually listen to you when you're not triggering their defense mechanisms. The second technique is asking genuine questions instead of making statements. Instead of saying, "You should consider this approach," you ask, "Have you thought about what might happen if you tried this approach?" Instead of, "That strategy won't work," you ask, "What do you think the challenges might be with that strategy?" The question format inherently respects their autonomy because it invites them to think and decide for themselves, rather than telling them what to think and decide. But the question has to be genuine. If you're asking a question that's really just a statement in disguise, if your tone makes it clear that you already know the answer and you're just waiting for them to figure it out, their brain will detect the manipulation and resist even more strongly than if you'd just been direct. The question has to come from real curiosity about their perspective, even if you think you already know what the answer should be. The third technique, and this one is counterintuitive, is validating their current position before offering any alternative. This doesn't mean agreeing with them if you don't actually agree. It means acknowledging that their position makes sense from their perspective and their experience, even if you think a different position would serve them better. "I can see why you'd think that given what you've experienced," or "That makes sense based on the information you have," signals to their brain that you're not attacking their judgment, which makes them much more willing to consider new information that might lead them to a different conclusion. Most people skip this step because it feels like you're conceding ground or wasting time. They want to jump straight to explaining why the person is wrong and what they should do instead. But that approach activates maximum resistance. Taking 30 seconds to validate their current thinking before offering a different perspective can be the difference between them digging in defensively and them actually being open to change. There's a negotiation expert who trains FBI hostage negotiators, and he teaches them a technique he calls tactical empathy. The idea is that before you can influence anyone's thinking or behavior, you have to make them feel understood and respected. Not agreed with, necessarily, but understood. Because once someone feels like you genuinely understand their position and respect their right to hold it, their defense system relaxes. They're not fighting you anymore. And in that relaxed state, they can actually think clearly and consider alternatives that they would have immediately rejected if they felt defensive. The same principle applies in every conversation where you're trying to influence someone. A business negotiation, a parenting conversation, a disagreement with your spouse, a pitch to a potential client. If you jump straight to what you want them to do or think, you're fighting against their defense system the entire time. But if you start by disarming that system, making them feel respected and autonomous, you're working with their brain instead of against it. One more thing about the brain's defense system that most people miss. It's not just about what you say in the moment. It's also about the pattern you've established over time. If you have a history of trying to control someone, of always needing to be right, of pushing your agenda constantly, their defense system will be on high alert the moment you start talking. Even if you're using all the right techniques in that specific conversation. You've trained their brain to expect a fight, so it's ready to fight before you even open your mouth. This is why some relationships feel like constant battles even over small things, while other relationships flow easily even when there are legitimate disagreements. It's not about the specific topics or who's right. It's about whether the defensive patterns have been triggered so many times that they're now the default response to any interaction. The good news is that patterns can be changed, but it takes consistency. If someone's brain expects you to try to control them, you need to prove through repeated interactions that you're not going to do that anymore. You need to disarm first, ask instead of tell, validate before challenging, and respect their autonomy consistently until their defense system learns that you're not a threat. It won't happen in one conversation. But over time, you can completely change the dynamic. For now, start practicing the disarm first approach in your daily interactions. Before you offer advice, ask if they want it. Before you challenge someone's thinking, acknowledge what makes sense about their current perspective. Before you push for a decision, make it clear that the choice is entirely theirs. And watch how differently people respond when they don't feel like they're being attacked or controlled. The goal isn't to be indirect or wishy-washy. The goal is to make your influence invisible by ensuring it never triggers resistance in the first place. And that starts with understanding that most resistance isn't about your idea. It's about their brain protecting itself from perceived threats to autonomy. Disarm the threat, and the resistance disappears. What's left is a person who can actually hear you and think clearly about what you're saying instead of fighting to defend themselves from you. Chapter 3. The Illusion of Choice. People don't want freedom. They want to feel free. That might sound like the same thing, but it's not. And understanding the difference between actual freedom and the feeling of freedom is one of the most powerful tools you'll ever have for influencing anyone's decisions. Because once you grasp this distinction, you can guide people toward specific outcomes while making them feel like they're making completely independent choices. They get the satisfaction of feeling autonomous. You get the result you wanted. Everyone wins. Most people approach influence backwards. They try to limit options, narrow choices, push people toward the right decision. And every step of that process triggers the exact resistance we talked about in the previous chapters. But what if instead of limiting options, you expanded them in a way that guided people exactly where you wanted them to go? What if you could give someone multiple choices and have all of those choices lead to the same fundamental outcome? That's not manipulation. That's architecture. And it's happening to you dozens of times every day without you even noticing. Think about the last time you went to a restaurant and looked at a menu. You felt like you had complete freedom to choose whatever you wanted, right? You weighed your options, considered your preferences, made a decision. But what you probably didn't realize is that the entire menu was carefully designed to guide your choices in specific directions. The layout, the descriptions, the prices, even which items were placed where on the page. All of it was strategically planned to make certain dishes more likely to be ordered than others. You thought you were choosing freely. The restaurant was guiding your choice invisibly. Or think about when you're buying a car and the salesperson asks, "Would you prefer the blue one or the silver one?" They're not giving you unlimited options. They're giving you two options, both of which involve you buying a car from them today. If they'd asked, "Are you sure you want to buy a car today?" they'd be giving you real freedom, including the freedom to walk away. But by framing the choice as which car rather than whether to buy, they're guiding you toward a decision while maintaining your feeling of autonomy. This principle is backed by decades of research in behavioral economics and psychology. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky revolutionized our understanding of decision-making with their work on cognitive biases and heuristics, showing that humans don't actually make rational choices based on careful analysis of all available information. We make choices based on how options are presented to us, and we can be predictably guided toward specific decisions by changing the frame around those options. What they discovered, and what subsequent researchers have confirmed over and over, is that most of our decisions are made unconsciously and emotionally first, then rationalized consciously afterward. Your brain decides what it wants based on factors you're not even aware of. And then your conscious mind comes up with logical-sounding reasons why that was obviously the right choice. You think you're choosing rationally. You're actually rationalizing choices that were already made at a level below conscious awareness. This is why facts and logic alone don't change behavior. They're not where decisions actually happen. Decisions happen in the emotional, intuitive part of the brain. And they're driven by factors like how options are framed, what the default choice is, how many options are presented, and in what order. The logical brain just provides the story we tell ourselves and others about why we chose what we chose. So if you want to influence someone's decision, you don't need to give them better facts or stronger arguments. You need to architect the decision environment so that the choice you want them to make feels like the obvious, natural, autonomous decision to them. One of the most effective ways to do this is through something called guided binary choice. Instead of giving someone an open-ended question that allows them to reject your entire premise, you give them two options that both accept your premise and differ only in details. Instead of, "Do you want to do this?" which allows for a yes or no answer, you ask, "Would you prefer to do this now or next week?" which assumes they're going to do it and only questions the timing. Watch how parents use this instinctively with young children. A parent who asks, "Do you want to go to bed?" is setting themselves up for a fight, because the child's honest answer is probably no. But a parent who asks, "Do you want to brush your teeth before bed or after you put on your pajamas?" is giving the child a sense of control and autonomy, while guiding them toward the outcome the parent wants, which is getting ready for bed. The child feels like they made a choice. The parent gets what they needed. No fight, no resistance. The same principle scales up to adult interactions. A manager who asks, "Can you take on this project?" might get resistance or hesitation. But a manager who asks, "This project needs someone starting either this week or next week. Which timing works better for you?" is architecting the choice so that taking on the project is assumed, and the only question is when. If the person genuinely can't or won't take it on, they can still say so. But the framing makes it much easier to say yes, because you're not asking them to commit to everything at once. You're just asking about one small detail, and once they commit to that detail, they've essentially committed to the whole thing. Another powerful technique in creating the illusion of choice is something researchers call the decoy effect, or asymmetric dominance. The idea is simple but brilliant. When you want someone to choose option A, you don't just present option A and option B and hope they pick the one you want. You present option A, option B, and option C, where option C is designed to make option A look obviously better by comparison. Economists at Duke University, including Dan Ariely, studied this extensively and found that it works remarkably well even when people are aware of what's happening. In one famous example, they looked at subscription pricing for a magazine. When given two options, let's say a digital subscription for $60 or a print subscription for $125, people were split fairly evenly between the options. But when they added a third option, a print-only subscription for $125 that was clearly worse than the print plus digital option at the same price, suddenly almost everyone chose the print plus digital option. The decoy made the target option look like an obvious bargain, even though the price hadn't changed. You can use this in everyday influence situations by always including a third option that's designed to make your preferred option look better. If you want someone to agree to help you with a project that will take 3 hours, don't just ask them to commit to 3 hours. Mention that you were initially thinking it might take 5 hours, but you've streamlined it to 3. Or present 3 options: 5 hours next week, 3 hours this week, or 1 hour now and 2 hours later. Suddenly 3 hours this week looks reasonable because it's not the biggest commitment and not as fragmented as the split option. The key is that the person needs to feel like they're genuinely choosing among real options. If it's too obvious that you're manipulating the choice architecture, their defense system activates and you're back to creating resistance. The art is in making the options all sound legitimate and viable, while subtly guiding toward the one you actually want. Framing is another crucial element in creating the illusion of choice, and it's one of the most underutilized tools in everyday influence. The same fact or option can be presented in completely different ways that lead to completely different decisions, depending on the frame you put around it. Kahneman and Tversky demonstrated this with their famous Asian disease problem. They told one group of participants to imagine a disease outbreak that would kill 600 people, and they had to choose between 2 programs. Program A would save 200 people for certain. Program B had a 1/3 chance of saving everyone and a 2/3 chance of saving no one. Most people chose Program A because saving 200 people sounded good. Then they presented the exact same scenario to a different group with different framing. Program A would result in 400 people dying for certain. Program B had a 1/3 chance that nobody would die and a 2/3 chance that everyone would die. With this framing, most people chose Program B, even though it's mathematically identical to the version they'd just rejected. The only difference was the frame. Described in terms of lives saved, people were risk-averse and chose the certain option. Described in terms of lives lost, people became risk-seeking and chose the gamble. Same facts, same options, opposite decisions. The frame controlled everything. You can use this in any situation where you need to influence a decision. If you want someone to take action on something, frame it in terms of what they'll lose by not acting rather than what they'll gain by acting. Loss aversion is one of the strongest decision-making biases humans have. We're far more motivated to avoid losses than to pursue equivalent gains. Instead of, "You'll save 15% on your insurance if you switch," frame it as, "You're currently losing 15% every year by not switching." Same money, different frame, much stronger motivation. Instead of, "This opportunity will help you grow your career," frame it as, "Staying in your current role will cost you this growth opportunity." The loss frame creates urgency that the gain frame doesn't. But you need to be strategic about when to use gain frames versus loss frames. If someone is already anxious or risk-averse, piling on more loss framing might paralyze them rather than motivate them. If someone is already excited and optimistic, loss framing might feel manipulative and trigger resistance. You need to read the person and the situation and choose your frame accordingly. Time framing is equally powerful and often overlooked. A payment of $3 per day sounds much more manageable than $1,095 per year, even though it's the same amount. A commitment of 20 minutes daily feels smaller than 2 hours and 20 minutes per week. A project that takes 30 minutes a day for a month sounds less daunting than a 15-hour project. Break things down into the smallest time increments that still make sense, and you'll get far less resistance. Contrast framing is another technique worth mastering. Whenever you present an option, you're presenting it in contrast to something, even if that something is just the status quo or some imagined alternative. And you can control what that contrast is to make your option look better. Instead of just saying, "This will take 3 hours of your time," say, "Most people think this kind of project takes 8 or 10 hours, but I've streamlined it to 3. Now 3 hours looks efficient instead of burdensome." Instead of, "This costs $500, say, "Similar services typically run between $800 and $1,200, but we've found a way to deliver the same quality for $500. Same price, but now it looks like a bargain." What you're doing in all of these cases is giving people genuine choices, or at least the experience of choosing, while strategically shaping the environment in which they're making those choices. You're not forcing anyone to do anything. You're not lying or manipulating facts. You're simply presenting options in ways that highlight certain aspects and downplay others, and that architecture makes specific choices feel more attractive, more obvious, more aligned with what they already want. The ethics of this approach come down to intention and outcome. If you're using these techniques to guide people toward decisions that genuinely serve their interests, that help them get what they actually want, then you're being a good influence. You're helping them navigate complexity and overcome the decision paralysis that comes from too many options or unclear framing. If you're using these techniques to trick people into decisions that serve you at their expense, then you've crossed into manipulation, and you'll eventually face the consequences when they figure out what happened. The difference between ethical influence and manipulation isn't in the techniques themselves. It's in whether the outcome is mutually beneficial or exploitative. Used well, these tools help people make better decisions more easily. Used poorly, they damage trust and relationships. So before you architect a choice, ask yourself honestly whether all of the options you're presenting would genuinely serve the other person well, or whether you're hiding a bad option behind clever framing. For the next week, start paying attention to how choices are presented to you in daily life. Notice when someone gives you a binary choice that assumes you're already on board with the premise. Notice when a menu or a product lineup includes an option that seems designed to make another option look better. Notice when information is framed in terms of gains versus losses and how that affects your own decision-making. Once you see the architecture of choice everywhere around you, you'll start to understand how to build it yourself in ways that guide people while respecting their autonomy. And remember, The goal isn't to trick people or take away their real freedom. The goal is to make good choices feel easy and obvious by removing unnecessary complexity and highlighting what matters. When you do that well, people thank you for helping them decide instead of resenting you for pushing them toward something they didn't really want. Chapter 4. The Art of Strategic Questions. The person asking questions controls the conversation. Most people think that making statements, presenting arguments, and declaring positions is how you demonstrate knowledge and authority in a conversation. They believe that the person talking the most, explaining the most, proving the most is the one in control. But they have it completely backwards. The person asking questions is directing the entire flow of thinking, and they're doing it so subtly that the other person doesn't even notice they're being guided. Questions are the most underutilized tool in influence, and that's because most people use them wrong. They ask questions as a way to gather information or to challenge someone's position. Why do you think that? Asked with a skeptical tone is really just another way of saying that's wrong. Have you considered this alternative? Is often just a statement disguised as a question, and people's defense systems can tell the difference. They know when a question is really an attack or a manipulation, and they respond accordingly. But when you ask genuine questions that come from curiosity rather than agenda, when you structure those questions to guide someone's thinking toward a specific conclusion without forcing them there, something remarkable happens. They start talking themselves into the position you wanted them to adopt. And they do it with full ownership and enthusiasm because, as far as they can tell, they figured it out themselves. This is called the Socratic method, named after the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, who rarely told his students what to think, but instead asked them questions that led them to discover truths on their own. And modern psychology has validated what Socrates understood intuitively thousands of years ago. People trust conclusions they reach themselves far more than conclusions handed to them by someone else, even when those conclusions are identical. When you tell someone what to think, you're asking them to replace their judgment with yours. When you ask questions that lead them to think through something systematically, you're helping them improve their own judgment, and they'll defend that judgment because it's theirs. The end result might be exactly what you wanted them to conclude, but they'll champion it with conviction instead of resisting it with skepticism. Think about the best teachers, therapists, or mentors you've ever had. Chances are they didn't lecture you constantly or tell you exactly what to do in every situation. They asked questions that made you think. They guided conversations in ways that helped you discover insights you hadn't seen before. And you walked away feeling smarter and more capable because you felt like you'd figured things out rather than being told what to think. That's the power of strategic questioning, and you can learn to do it in any conversation where you need to influence someone's thinking. The key is understanding that questions have a structure, and different structures lead thinking in different directions. A well-designed sequence of questions can take someone from where they are now to where you need them to be without them ever feeling pushed or manipulated. Because each question genuinely invites their input and respects their autonomy, while subtly narrowing the focus toward a specific conclusion. The technique I call the question funnel works like this. You start with broad, open-ended questions that let the person talk about what matters to them, what they're thinking, what they want. This builds rapport and gives you information about how they're framing the situation. Then you gradually ask more specific questions that direct their attention toward particular aspects of the situation, particular consequences, particular alternatives. And by the end, you're asking questions that make the conclusion you wanted seem obvious to them, because you've walked them through the logical path that leads there. Let's say you're trying to convince a colleague to take on a new project approach that you think will be more effective. But you know, if you just tell them to change their approach, they'll resist. Instead of arguing for your method, you start by asking broad questions about their current experience. How's the project going so far? What's working well? What's been challenging? These questions don't have an agenda. They're genuinely interested in their perspective. And they give the person space to talk, which makes them feel heard and respected. As they talk, you listen for openings where you can ask more focused questions. If they mention that something is taking longer than expected, you might ask, "What do you think is causing the delay?" Notice you're not suggesting causes or offering solutions yet. You're asking them to think through the problem. They might say they're spending too much time on a particular phase of the work. So you ask, what would happen if you approach that phase differently? Now you're guiding their thinking toward alternatives without telling them what to do. They might come up with their own ideas, which is great. Or they might say they're not sure what alternatives would work. That's when you can say, would it help to explore a few options together? And then ask questions about different approaches, including the one you wanted them to consider in the first place. By the time you describe your preferred method, it's one option among several, not the right answer you're trying to force on them. And because you've spent the conversation asking questions and listening to their thinking, when you do offer input, it feels like collaboration rather than control. They're much more likely to adopt your suggestion because the entire conversation has respected their autonomy and intelligence. The question funnel works because it creates a sense of discovery rather than instruction. Each question builds on what came before, narrowing the focus while making the person feel like they're thinking it through themselves. And the beauty is that even if they arrive at a different conclusion than the one you wanted, you've still accomplished something valuable. You've helped them think more clearly about the situation, and you've maintained the relationship and trust that makes future influence possible. One crucial aspect of strategic questioning that most people miss is the power of silence after you ask a question. The natural human impulse is to fill silence with more talking. You ask a question, the person hesitates for a moment, and you immediately jump in with more explanation or clarification or another question. But that hesitation, that pause where they're thinking, that's where the real work is happening. That's when their brain is processing, considering, making connections. If you interrupt that process by talking, you rob them of the chance to think it through and rob yourself of the chance to hear what they're really thinking. Top negotiators understand this instinctively. They ask a question, then they wait, sometimes for seconds that feel uncomfortably long. And in that silence, the other person feels the need to fill the space. And when they do, they often reveal more than they intended or talk themselves into positions they weren't initially planning to take. The silence after a question isn't empty time. It's productive pressure. It's giving someone space to think while also subtly communicating that you expect them to engage seriously with what you asked. And people rise to that expectation. They think harder. They dig deeper. They come up with better answers than if you'd rushed them or filled the silence yourself. But the question has to be genuine for this to work. If you ask a leading question where the answer you want is obvious, or if you ask with a tone that communicates judgment about what the right answer should be, the other person will recognize it as manipulation, and they'll either give you the answer they think you want to hear without really meaning it, or they'll resist and give you the opposite answer just to assert their autonomy. Genuine questions come from genuine curiosity. Even if you think you know the answer, even if you have a strong opinion about what they should conclude, you ask as if you really want to understand their thinking and perspective. You listen to their answer with openness, rather than waiting for them to finish so you can correct them or steer them back to your preferred answer. And when you do that consistently, people start to trust that you're not trying to manipulate them. which makes them much more willing to seriously consider ideas that emerge from the conversation. There's a specific type of question that's particularly effective at shifting perspective without creating resistance. And it's called the miracle question, or the future-focused question. Instead of asking people to justify or defend their current position, you ask them to imagine a future where their situation is different and work backwards from there. For example, if someone is stuck in a pattern they know isn't working, but they can't seem to break out of, instead of asking, "Why do you keep doing this?" which puts them on the defensive, you could ask, "If you woke up tomorrow and this problem was completely solved, what would be different? What would you notice first?" This question bypasses the need to admit failure or weakness in the present and lets them imagine success, which often reveals insights about what needs to change. Or if you're trying to get someone to commit to a goal they're hesitant about, instead of pushing them to commit now, you might ask, a year from now, if you've accomplished this goal, what will that feel like? What will have changed in your life? You're letting them visualize success and connect emotionally with what they want, which creates motivation that comes from inside them rather than from your external pressure. Future-focused questions are powerful because they shift energy from defending the past or justifying the present to imagining possibilities. And once someone has imagined a better future and articulated what it looks like, they've created a mental picture that their brain naturally wants to move toward. You haven't told them what to do. You've helped them clarify what they want, and now they'll be motivated to figure out how to get there. Another category of strategic questions involves exploring consequences without lecturing. Instead of saying, "If you do that, this bad thing will happen," which creates resistance, you ask, "What do you think might happen if you try that approach?" You're asking them to think through consequences themselves, which is far more effective than warning them because they can't argue with their own reasoning. If they say they think it will work out fine, you can follow up with, "What would need to be true for that to work?" Or, "What could go wrong that might prevent that outcome?" These questions aren't challenging them directly. They're inviting deeper analysis. And often in the process of answering these questions, people talk themselves out of bad ideas or refine their thinking without you having to argue against them. Conversely, if you want someone to commit to something they're hesitant about, you can explore positive consequences with questions like, "If this works the way we hope, what becomes possible that isn't possible now?" Or, "Who else benefits if you succeed with this?" These questions help them see value and impact beyond their immediate fears, which can shift their emotional calculation from "this is risky and I might fail" to "this is worth doing because of what it creates." The structure of how you ask matters as much as what you ask. Open questions that start with "what," "how," or "tell me about" invite exploration and expansion. They give people room to think and talk. Closed questions that can be answered with yes or no or a single word give you information but don't invite deeper thinking. Both have their place, but if you're trying to guide someone's thinking, open questions are usually more powerful. For example, "Do you think this approach will work?" is a closed question that might get you a yes or no. "What do you think would make this approach work?" is an open question that invites them to think through conditions for success, which gets them invested in making it successful. "How do you see this playing out?" asks them to walk through the process mentally, which helps them identify both opportunities and obstacles. "What concerns do you have?" is more productive than "Are you worried about anything?" because it assumes they have concerns and invites them to articulate them rather than yes, no, whether concerns exist. One more advanced technique worth mastering is the presuppositional question. where the structure of the question assumes something is already decided and only asks about details. When would be the best time to start this? Presupposes that it will be started and only questions timing. How should we roll this out to the team? Presupposes that it will be rolled out and only questions method. These questions work because they move the conversation past whether something will happen to how it will happen. And once someone is thinking about how, they've mentally committed to the decision even if they haven't explicitly said yes. But you have to be careful with presuppositional questions because if someone isn't ready to commit, they'll feel manipulated and push back. The key is to use them only after you've built buy-in through earlier questions that invited their genuine input. If you've spent the conversation respecting their autonomy and seriously considering their perspective, a presuppositional question toward the end feels like a natural next step in the conversation. If you jump straight to it without building that foundation, it feels like pressure and triggers resistance. For the next week, practice replacing statements with questions in your conversations. Anytime you catch yourself about to tell someone what you think or what they should do, pause and turn it into a question instead. Instead of, "I think you should approach it this way." Try, "What would happen if you approached it this way?" Instead of, "That won't work because of X." Try, "How would you handle X in that approach?" Watch what happens when you give people space to think through things themselves with your questions as gentle guides rather than directives. You'll find that they often arrive at the same conclusions you would have pushed for, but they'll own those conclusions in a way they never would have owned your advice. And even when they don't arrive where you hoped, you'll learn something valuable about their thinking that will help you influence them more effectively in future conversations. Remember, questions don't make you sound uncertain or weak. They make you sound thoughtful and respectful. And in a world where most people are constantly trying to tell others what to think, the person who asks good questions and actually listens to the answers stands out as someone worth trusting and following. Chapter 5. Planting seeds, not building walls. The most powerful ideas are the ones people think they came up with themselves. When you try to force an idea into someone's mind through argument and persuasion, you're building a wall between you and them. Every fact you present is another brick. Every logical point is more mortar. And by the time you're finished constructing your case, you've built such a substantial barrier that the person can't see past it to the idea you were trying to share. All they see is the wall you built, and they instinctively want to tear it down or fortify their side against it. But what if instead of building walls, you planted seeds? What if you introduced ideas so subtly, so gently, that they didn't trigger any defense mechanisms at all? The person wouldn't even register that you'd suggested anything. They'd simply absorb the information as part of a natural conversation. And then weeks or months later, that seed would grow into a thought that felt completely original to them. They'd bring the idea to you enthusiastically, having no memory that you mentioned it first. And you'd support their brilliant idea while knowing exactly what you did. This isn't manipulation. It's understanding how the human mind actually processes and adopts new ideas. The brain doesn't change its beliefs and behaviors in response to dramatic, one-time arguments. It changes gradually through repeated exposure to information in non-threatening contexts. Each exposure is like water on a seed. Too much at once drowns it. The right amount at the right intervals allows it to take root and grow. Psychologists call this the mere exposure effect or the familiarity principle. Research going back decades has shown that people develop preferences for things simply through repeated exposure to them, even when they're not consciously paying attention to those exposures. Robert Zajonks demonstrated this in experiments, where people were shown various stimuli, some more frequently than others. When asked later which ones they preferred, people consistently chose the ones they'd been exposed to more often, even when they had no conscious memory of seeing them before. The applications to influence are obvious. If you want someone to adopt an idea, you don't need to make a compelling argument for it once. You need to mention it casually multiple times in different contexts, allowing their brain to become familiar with it without ever feeling pressured to accept it. Over time, that familiarity becomes comfort, and comfort becomes preference. The idea moves from foreign to familiar to obvious without them ever having to consciously decide to adopt it. Think about how advertising works at its most effective level. Companies don't run one brilliant ad that convinces everyone to buy their product. They run the same brand message hundreds of times across multiple channels until that brand becomes part of the cultural landscape. You don't remember deciding that Nike represents athletic achievement or that Apple represents creative innovation. Those associations were built through thousands of small exposures that shaped your perception gradually over time. And now those connections feel natural and obvious to you, as if they'd always been there. You can use the same principle in everyday influence, and it's far more effective than trying to win arguments. The technique is simple, but requires patience and strategic thinking. You identify an idea you want someone to eventually adopt, and then you mention it casually in conversation without any pressure for them to agree or act on it. Just plant the seed and move on. No follow-up, no explanation, no attempt to convince them it's right. Just, I read somewhere that, or someone mentioned to me recently that, and then change the subject. The key is that it has to feel completely casual and unattached to any agenda. If they sense that you're testing the waters or trying to convince them of something, their defense system activates and the seed dies before it can take root. But if you mention it the way you'd mention what you had for breakfast, as a simple piece of information with no emotional charge or expectation attached, it bypasses their defenses entirely and lodges in their memory as neutral data. Then, a week or two later, you mention the same idea again in a different context. Still casual, still no pressure. Maybe you frame it slightly differently or connect it to a different aspect of their situation. You're not building on the first mention or reminding them that you brought this up before. You're just sharing something interesting that happens to be related to the same core concept. Each mention is water on the seed. Each exposure makes the idea more familiar, more comfortable, more normal. What you're doing is incredibly powerful, but it requires restraint. The natural impulse when you mention an idea is to elaborate on it. Explain why it's good. Try to get the person to agree with you right then and there. Resist that impulse completely. The moment you start explaining or defending or asking for agreement, you've shifted from planting seeds to building walls. The person's brain switches from passively receiving information to actively defending against persuasion, and all your careful work is wasted. There's a story about a CEO who wanted to reorganize his company's structure, but knew that if he proposed it directly, his executive team would resist because it would threaten their existing power dynamics. So instead of calling a meeting to announce the reorganization, he started mentioning small observations in casual conversations. I've been noticing our response times are slower than they used to be. A week later, someone from another company mentioned they restructured their teams and it helped with efficiency. Another week, I wonder if there's a better way to organize our workflow. Each comment was brief and seemed like he was thinking out loud rather than proposing anything. Over the course of 3 months, he planted dozens of these seeds across multiple conversations with different executives. He never connected them into a comprehensive proposal. He never pushed anyone to agree with him. He just kept watering the seeds with casual observations and questions. And then one day, one of his executives came to him excited about an idea he'd been thinking about. He proposed almost exactly the reorganization the CEO had wanted from the beginning, and he presented it as his own brilliant insight into what the company needed. The CEO praised the idea enthusiastically. They refined it together, and the entire executive team adopted it because it came from one of their peers rather than being imposed from above. That's seed planting at its finest. The CEO got exactly what he wanted. But nobody felt controlled or manipulated because the idea genuinely felt like it had emerged organically from the team's collective thinking. And in a way, it had. The CEO didn't force the idea into anyone's mind. He created conditions where that idea could grow naturally in someone else's mind. And once it took root there, it flourished with all the strength of an idea that person believed they'd originated themselves. Another powerful technique for planting seeds is using third-party references instead of stating your own opinion. When you say, "I think you should try this approach," you're putting your credibility and judgment on the line, and the person has to either accept your authority or defend their independence by rejecting your suggestion. But when you say, "I heard about someone who tried this approach and it worked really well for them," you're not asking them to trust your judgment. You're just sharing information about someone else's experience. There's nothing to resist because you're not personally advocating for anything. This works because it leverages social proof without creating pressure. People are naturally influenced by what others do, especially others who are similar to them or who they perceive as successful. When you tell them about someone else's success with an approach, you're activating their curiosity and their competitive instincts without triggering their defensive instincts. They don't feel like they're being told what to do. They feel like they're hearing about an option that might be worth considering on their own terms. The beauty of third-party references is that you don't even need to identify the person specifically. A friend of mine, or someone I know, or I read about a company that, all work perfectly well and might actually work better than naming specific people because they're vague enough that the listener can project onto them whoever they want. The seed isn't "this specific person succeeded." It's "people like me are succeeding with this approach." And that seed is incredibly powerful once it takes root. You can also plant seeds through questions that introduce ideas without advocating for them. What do you think would happen if you tried X? Doesn't tell them to try X. It just invites them to imagine trying X, and imagination is the first step toward action. Once someone has mentally rehearsed doing something, they're much more likely to actually do it because the brain treats imagined experiences almost like real ones. You've made the action familiar before they've even taken it. Or you can use hypothetical framing that distances you from any agenda. I wonder what it would look like if, or I'm curious whether, signals that you're exploring possibilities rather than pushing conclusions. The person can engage with the hypothetical without feeling like they're committing to anything or agreeing with you about anything. And in that safe space of hypothetical exploration, seeds get planted that eventually become real considerations. One thing to be very careful about with seed planting is that you can't be impatient. The entire technique relies on allowing time for the idea to become familiar and for the person to forget where they first encountered it. If you plant seeds on Monday and then on Wednesday you're asking, "So have you thought any more about that thing I mentioned?" You've just watered the seed with poison. You've reminded them that this is your idea and you're pushing it, which activates resistance and kills whatever progress the seed had made. You have to trust the process and be willing to wait weeks or even months for seeds to grow. In some cases, you might never see the result directly. The person might adopt the idea long after you've stopped interacting with them regularly. Or they might implement some version of it that's different enough that you don't recognize your original seed in it. That's fine. The goal isn't to get credit for the idea. The goal is to influence outcomes, and seed planting does that more reliably than any amount of direct argument. There's also an ethical dimension to seed planting that you need to think through before using it. Because this technique is so subtle and because people genuinely forget where ideas came from, you have significant power to shape someone's thinking without them knowing it. That power can be used to help people discover insights that serve them well. Or it can be used to manipulate people toward conclusions that serve your interests at their expense. The difference comes down to intent and honesty. If you're planting seeds because you genuinely believe the idea will benefit the person and you're being patient because you want them to adopt it for the right reasons rather than just to comply with your pressure, then you're using influence ethically. If you're planting seeds to trick someone into doing something they wouldn't choose if they had full information, then you're manipulating them, and the consequences of that will eventually catch up with you when they realize what happened. A good rule of thumb is to only plant seeds for ideas that you'd be comfortable openly advocating for if you were asked directly. If you'd be embarrassed or defensive about acknowledging that you want this person to adopt this idea, then you probably shouldn't be planting those seeds. But if you'd be happy to discuss the idea openly, and your only reason for planting seeds instead is that you understand direct advocacy would trigger resistance and make it less likely they'd consider the idea fairly, then you're probably on solid ethical ground. For the next 2 weeks, practice planting seeds without trying to see immediate results. Choose one idea that you'd like someone in your life to consider, but instead of arguing for it or even suggesting it directly, find ways to mention related concepts casually in different conversations. Notice how it feels to share an idea without attaching any expectation to it. Notice whether you can resist the urge to elaborate or convince. And then let it go and see what grows over time. Remember, the goal is familiarity and comfort, not agreement or action. You're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're simply introducing information into their environment in ways that allow their brain to process it naturally without defenses getting in the way. And over time, what was foreign becomes familiar. What was familiar becomes comfortable, and what was comfortable becomes preferred. That's how real change happens in human minds, not through winning arguments, but through patient cultivation of ideas that eventually feel like they were there all along. Chapter 6. The power of reframing change. The frame. Change the decision. Two people can look at exactly the same situation, the same set of facts, the same objective reality, and reach completely opposite conclusions about what it means and what should be done about it. The difference isn't in the facts themselves. The difference is in the frame through which they're viewing those facts. And whoever controls the frame controls the decision, because the frame determines which aspects of reality get attention and which get ignored, which interpretations seem obvious and which seem absurd. Most people think that facts speak for themselves, that reality is just reality regardless of how you describe it. But cognitive science has proven beyond doubt that this isn't true. The human brain doesn't process raw reality. It processes interpreted reality, and that interpretation is shaped entirely by the frame through which information is presented. Change the frame, and you change everything about how that information registers emotionally and what conclusions people draw from it, even when the actual facts remain identical. This is both unsettling and incredibly useful. It's unsettling because it means that much of what you think about as objective truth is actually shaped by frames you didn't choose and probably aren't even aware of. Every news story you read, every conversation you have, every decision you make is happening within frames that were constructed by someone. And those frames are influencing your thinking in ways you don't consciously recognize. But it's useful because once you understand how framing works, you can become intentional about the frames you use when communicating with others. You can present the same facts in ways that lead to dramatically different emotional responses and decisions. You can guide thinking not by changing reality or lying about facts, but simply by highlighting certain aspects while downplaying others, by using language that activates certain associations while suppressing others. The classic demonstration of framing comes from research by Kahneman and Tversky that we touched on earlier. They presented people with a scenario where a disease outbreak was expected to kill 600 people, and 2 treatment programs were being considered. In one version, Program A was described as saving 200 people for certain, while Program B had a 1/3 chance of saving everyone and a 2/3 chance of saving nobody. Most people chose Program A because saving 200 people sounded good and certain. Then they presented the exact same scenario to different people, but changed only the frame. Program A would result in 400 people dying for certain. Program B had a 1/3 chance that nobody would die and a 2/3 chance that everyone would die. With this framing, most people chose Program B, even though mathematically it's identical to the version where they chose Program A. Same facts, same options, opposite choices. The only difference was whether outcomes were framed in terms of lives saved or lives lost. This isn't people being irrational or stupid. This is the human brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, which is respond emotionally to threats and opportunities based on how information is presented. When outcomes are framed as gains, people become risk-averse and prefer certainty. When outcomes are framed as losses, people become risk-seeking and prefer to gamble rather than accept certain loss. Neither response is wrong. They're both adaptive depending on context, but they're completely determined by the frame, not by the facts. You use this principle every time you need to motivate someone to take action. If you want them to maintain the status quo, you frame change as risky and uncertain. If you want them to embrace change, you frame the status quo as a certain loss and change as an opportunity to avoid that loss. Same situation, different frame, opposite behaviors. Let's say you're trying to convince someone to invest in a new technology for their business. If you frame it as, "This will increase your revenue by 15%, you're using a gain frame. It sounds good, but it doesn't create urgency because the person isn't currently losing money. They're just not gaining as much as they could. They might decide to wait, gather more information, see how things develop. But if you frame the exact same technology as, "Your competitors are already using this, and every month you delay means you're losing market share and revenue to them," now you've created a loss frame. The person isn't thinking about potential gains anymore. They're thinking about actual losses happening right now. And loss aversion is one of the strongest motivators in human psychology. Losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. So framing something as preventing loss is far more motivating than framing it as creating gain. However, you need to be strategic about which frame you use because the wrong frame can backfire. If someone is already anxious or overwhelmed, piling on loss framing might paralyze them instead of motivating them. They might shut down emotionally rather than taking action. In that case, a gain frame that focuses on positive outcomes and opportunities might be more effective because it reduces anxiety and creates hope instead of fear. Similarly, if someone is already optimistic and action-oriented, loss framing might seem overly negative or manipulative to them. They might resist the frame itself and push back against your message. With optimistic people, sometimes the best frame is one that emphasizes opportunity and possibility rather than threat and loss. You're matching the frame to the person's current emotional state and personality, rather than using the same frame for everyone. Another powerful type of framing involves how you describe the scale or significance of something. The exact same amount of money, time, or effort can sound trivial or enormous, depending on the unit you use to describe it. A payment of $3 per day sounds manageable and small. A payment of $1,095 per year sounds substantial. A commitment of 20 minutes daily feels reasonable. A commitment of 2 hours and 20 minutes per week sounds more demanding. A project that takes 30 minutes a day for a month sounds less daunting than a 15-hour project. You're not lying about the numbers. You're just choosing the frame that makes the commitment feel more acceptable or the cost feel more reasonable. And that choice of frame dramatically affects whether people say yes or no, even though the actual commitment is identical. Time framing works especially well when you're trying to get someone to commit to a new habit or routine. Instead of asking them to commit to the total time investment over a year, which sounds enormous, you break it down to the smallest unit that still makes sense. Just 5 minutes a day is far less intimidating than 30 hours a year, even though it's the same thing. Once they've started with 5 minutes daily, the habit often grows naturally because the barrier to entry was so low. But if you'd led with the annual total, they might never have started at all. Contrast framing is another technique that deserves attention. When you present an option, you're always presenting it in implicit or explicit contrast to something. And you can control what that something is, which shapes how the option is perceived. The exact same price can seem like a bargain or a rip-off, depending on what you compare it to. The exact same time commitment can seem reasonable or excessive, depending on what alternative you contrast it with. Real estate agents use this instinctively. Before showing clients the house they think the clients will want, they show them houses that are overpriced or have obvious problems. Then when they show the target house, it looks fantastic by comparison, even if it's just average in absolute terms. The contrast frame makes it feel like a great deal because the alternative they just saw was worse. The agent hasn't lied about anything. They've just controlled the comparison context. You can do the same thing in any situation where you're presenting options. If you want someone to agree to a particular commitment or price, don't present it in isolation. Present it alongside a more extreme version that you don't actually expect them to choose. We could do the full program, which takes 5 hours a week, or we could do the condensed version, which takes 3 hours a week. The 5-hour version makes 3 hours seem reasonable by comparison, even if 3 hours would have seemed like a lot if presented alone. Or if you're trying to get someone to agree to a price, mention what premium alternatives cost before revealing your price. Similar services typically run between $800 and $1,200, but we've streamlined our process to offer this for $500. The high-end comparison makes $500 seem affordable, even if $500 is objectively a lot of money for that particular service. Language framing is equally important and often overlooked. The specific words you use to describe a situation create frames that shape how people respond emotionally. Consider the difference between these pairs. Challenge versus problem. Investment versus cost. Opportunity versus obligation. Growth versus change. Each pair refers to similar concepts, but the frames they create are entirely different. A challenge sounds surmountable and even exciting. A problem sounds negative and burdensome. An investment implies future return and wise use of resources. A cost implies expense and loss. An opportunity sounds like something you'd want to pursue. An obligation sounds like something you're forced to do. Growth sounds positive and natural. Change sounds disruptive and uncertain. When you're trying to influence someone, Choosing language that frames the situation positively makes them more open to what you're suggesting. Instead of, "This will require you to change how you work," you say, "This will help you grow your skills and become more effective." Instead of, "This costs $1,500, you say, "This is an investment of $1,500 that will return 10 times that in increased revenue." Instead of, "You have a problem with your current system," you say, "You have an opportunity to improve your current system." You're not lying or sugarcoating. You're choosing frames that help the person see the situation in ways that make positive action more likely. And because frames shape thinking and emotion at a level below conscious awareness, the person won't feel like you're spinning or manipulating. The frame will just feel like an accurate description of reality to them. One advanced framing technique involves creating a frame that redefines what success looks like or what the relevant comparison is. Instead of accepting the frame that someone else has established, you introduce a new frame that changes the entire conversation. This is particularly useful when you're facing objections or resistance that's based on a frame you didn't choose and don't want to accept. For example, if someone says, "That's too expensive," they're operating within a frame where price is the primary consideration. You could try to argue that the price is actually reasonable, but that keeps you trapped in their frame. Instead, you might reframe entirely by saying, "What if we think about this not in terms of price, but in terms of value per outcome?" Now you've shifted the frame from cost to value, and you've created an opportunity to talk about what they're getting rather than what they're paying. Or if someone says, "This will take too long," instead of arguing about time frames, you could reframe by asking, "What if we measured this not by how long it takes, but by how much time it saves you once it's implemented?" Now the frame is about net time rather than investment time, which completely changes the calculation. The key is recognizing that you don't have to accept the frame that's initially presented. Frames are constructs, not realities. And if the current frame isn't serving the conversation productively, you have every right to propose a different frame that might lead to better thinking and better outcomes for everyone involved. Practice reframing in your daily conversations for the next week. When someone presents a situation in a way that leads to unproductive thinking, try offering a different frame and see what happens. Instead of thinking about this as a problem, what if we thought about it as a challenge to solve? Or, rather than focusing on what we're losing, what if we focus on what we're gaining? Watch how people's emotional responses and their thinking shifts when you offer frames that highlight different aspects of the same reality. Remember, you're not changing facts. You're changing focus. And focus determines everything about how people interpret situations and what they decide to do about them. Master the art of framing, and you master the art of shaping how people think without ever needing to argue with them about what's true. Chapter 7. Controlling the environment. You don't need to change their mind. Change their environment. Most people focus all their influence efforts on what they say and how they say it. They craft perfect arguments, choose their words carefully, structure their logic flawlessly. And then they wonder why their brilliant communication fails to produce the results they wanted. What they're missing is that influence doesn't just happen through words. It happens through context. And context is determined by environment. Where and when a conversation happens shapes its outcome as much as what's said during that conversation. Who else is present? What the physical space looks like? What time of day it is? Whether people are sitting or standing, whether they're comfortable or uncomfortable. All of these environmental factors create a psychological context that either supports or undermines whatever message you're trying to communicate. Think about it. The same conversation in a busy, noisy coffee shop produces different results than the same conversation in a quiet office. The same proposal presented first thing in the morning when people are fresh gets a different reception than the same proposal presented right before lunch when everyone's hungry and distracted. The same request made when you're sitting next to someone feels different than when you're sitting across from them with a table between you, creating physical and psychological distance. These aren't minor details. They're fundamental aspects of how human psychology works in social situations. And if you're not paying attention to them, if you're leaving environmental factors to chance, you're fighting an unnecessary battle against contexts that might be working against you when they could be working for you with just a bit of strategic planning. Research in environmental psychology has shown that physical space affects behavior and decision-making in predictable ways. Ceiling height influences whether people think abstractly or concretely. Lighting affects mood and energy levels. Temperature affects patience and willingness to compromise. Seating arrangements affect power dynamics and collaboration. These aren't metaphors or vague correlations. They're measurable, replicable effects that shape outcomes whether people are aware of them or not. A study from the University of Minnesota found that people in rooms with 10-foot ceilings were better at abstract thinking and creative problem-solving, while people in rooms with 8-foot ceilings were better at detail-oriented, concrete tasks. The ceiling height literally shaped what kind of thinking people did. If you're trying to get someone to see the big picture or think creatively, meeting in a space with high ceilings helps. If you need them to focus on specific details and execution, a smaller space with lower ceilings creates a more suitable psychological environment. Similarly, research on color psychology shows that different colors affect mood and behavior in consistent ways. Blue environments promote calm and focus, which makes them ideal for conversations that require careful thinking and analysis. Red environments increase arousal and urgency, which can be useful when you need quick decisions and action. Green environments promote relaxation and creativity. Warm colors like orange make spaces feel more intimate and comfortable, while cool colors create a sense of spaciousness and formality. You might not always have control over the color of the walls, but you can often choose which room or which location to use for important conversations. And that choice matters more than most people realize. The environment isn't just the backdrop for your influence attempt. It's an active part of the influence process itself, creating a mood and a mindset that either supports what you're trying to accomplish or works against it. Time of day is another environmental factor that dramatically affects how receptive people are to ideas and how willing they are to make decisions. Research on circadian rhythms and decision-making shows that most people have their highest cognitive functioning and best self-control during the morning hours. Energy and willpower decline throughout the day as decision fatigue sets in. By late afternoon, people are more likely to stick with default options, less likely to carefully analyze new proposals, and more likely to say no to things that require effort or risk. Israeli researchers studying parole hearings found a startling pattern. Judges were far more likely to grant parole to prisoners who appeared before them early in the morning or right after breaks, and far less likely to grant parole to prisoners who appeared later in the session or right before breaks. The prisoners' actual cases and circumstances didn't change, but the judges' decision-making was heavily influenced by their energy levels and decision fatigue. Early in the day or after food breaks, the judges had the mental resources to consider cases individually and grant parole when appropriate. Later in sessions, when they were tired and depleted, they defaulted to the safer, lower-effort option of denying parole. The implications for influence are obvious. If you need someone to seriously consider a new idea that requires mental effort to evaluate, morning is far better than afternoon. If you need them to agree to something that involves risk or change, timing the conversation for when their willpower and cognitive resources are highest dramatically increases your chances of success. And if you're negotiating or discussing anything where you need their flexible thinking rather than rigid adherence to defaults, making sure they're well rested and recently fed makes an enormous difference. Physical comfort also plays a larger role than most people recognize. When people are physically uncomfortable, whether from temperature, seating, noise, or any other source of discomfort, they become more negative in their thinking and less willing to cooperate or agree to new proposals. Discomfort creates stress, even mild discomfort, and stress activates defensive thinking. People become more focused on escaping the uncomfortable situation than on carefully considering whatever you're trying to communicate. Conversely, physical comfort creates psychological openness. When people are comfortable, warm but not hot, seated in a way that doesn't create physical strain, in an environment with appropriate noise levels and good air quality, they're more relaxed, more optimistic, and more willing to consider new ideas. They have mental bandwidth available for actually thinking about your message instead of dealing with the distractions created by their physical discomfort. This is why savvy negotiators pay attention to seemingly trivial details like the comfort of the chairs, the temperature of the room, whether refreshments are available. They're not just being nice. They're creating an environment that makes agreement more likely by reducing sources of stress and discomfort that would otherwise work against them. Social context is equally important and often overlooked. Who else is present during a conversation dramatically shapes what people feel comfortable saying and agreeing to. The presence of authority figures makes people more cautious and less likely to express disagreement or take risks. The presence of peers creates social pressure to conform to group norms. The presence of subordinates or people who depend on you creates pressure to appear strong and decisive, which can make someone less willing to admit uncertainty or change their position. If you want someone to be open and honest about concerns or doubts, having that conversation privately is essential. If you want someone to agree to something that might be seen as risky or unconventional, discussing it without their peers present removes the social pressure to appear cautious. If you want someone to feel comfortable admitting they don't know something or need help, making sure authority figures aren't in the room creates safety to be vulnerable. On the other hand, if you want to leverage social pressure to encourage someone to agree with something, having peers present who already support the idea can be powerful. People look to others for cues about what's acceptable and what's expected. And if everyone in the room seems to be on board with an idea, it becomes much easier for the last holdout to agree rather than standing alone against the group. This is social proof in action. And the environment you create by controlling who's present determines whether that force works for you or against you. Even small details like whether you're sitting or standing and the arrangement of furniture affect power dynamics and cooperation. Standing during conversations creates more formality and emphasizes hierarchy and status differences. Sitting creates informality and reduces perceived status differences. Sitting across a table from someone creates a subtle sense of opposition, you versus them, which can reinforce competitive thinking. Sitting next to someone or at a 90-degree angle eliminates that oppositional dynamic and promotes collaborative thinking. Territorial psychology matters too. Having an important conversation in your office or space where you're on your territory gives you a subtle psychological advantage because the other person is in your environment and you're comfortable there. Having the conversation in their space gives them that advantage. Meeting on neutral territory, like a conference room that neither of you owns or a coffee shop, creates more balance but less control over other environmental factors. The key insight is that you should be intentional about all of these choices rather than leaving them to chance. When you have an important conversation coming up where you need to influence someone's thinking or decision, don't just focus on preparing what you'll say. Think strategically about when and where to have that conversation, who should be present, and what physical environment would best support the outcome you're trying to achieve. If you need someone to think creatively and see possibilities, choose a comfortable, informal environment with high ceilings and good natural light. Schedule the conversation for morning when their energy's highest and have it privately, so social pressure doesn't constrain their thinking. If you need someone to focus on practical details and commit to specific actions, choose a smaller, more formal environment. Have the conversation mid-morning when they're alert but not at peak creative thinking, and consider having key stakeholders present so there's accountability. If you're trying to get someone to take a risk or try something new, remove as many sources of physical and social discomfort as possible. Meet on neutral territory so they don't feel defensive. And time it for when they're well rested and have eaten recently, so their willpower and decision-making resources are strong. If you're trying to get someone to maintain a course of action or support a decision they've already made, reinforcing factors like having authority figures present or meeting in a formal environment can strengthen their commitment. None of this is about tricking people or creating artificial pressure. It's about aligning environmental factors with the kind of thinking and decision-making you need from the conversation. You're removing obstacles and reducing friction that would work against productive dialogue, and you're leveraging contextual factors that make good decisions easier to reach. For the next 2 weeks, pay attention to how environment affects your own thinking and decisions. Notice when you feel more creative versus more analytical, more open versus more defensive, more energized versus more depleted. Notice how the physical space, the time of day, who else is around, and how comfortable you are physically all influence your mental state. And then start thinking strategically about how you can control these factors when you need to influence others. Creating contexts that support the outcomes you're working toward instead of leaving context to chance. Chapter 8. Invisible Signals, Body Language and Trust. People decide whether to trust you in 7 seconds, and most of that decision happens before you say a single word. You've been taught that what you say matters most, that if you can just find the right words, the perfect argument, the most compelling evidence, you'll be able to influence anyone. But research in nonverbal communication tells a very different story. Studies consistently show that when verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, people believe the nonverbal message every time. Your body, your face, your voice, your gestures, all of these communicate constantly, and they communicate more powerfully than your words ever can. This isn't about learning to fake confidence or manufacture charisma. People can detect inauthenticity in nonverbal communication far better than they can detect it in words, because nonverbal signals are harder to consciously control and easier to read at an intuitive level. If you try to project confidence while feeling insecure, or warmth while feeling cold, the mismatch will leak through your body language and make people trust you less, not more. What this chapter is about is understanding what your nonverbal communication is already saying, becoming aware of the signals you're sending without realizing it, and learning to align your physical presence with your intentions so that your body isn't working against your words. Because right now, for most people, there's a constant low-level conflict between what they're saying and what their body is communicating. And that conflict undermines their influence every single day without them ever knowing why. The first and most important element of nonverbal communication is eye contact. Humans are wired to read enormous amounts of information from where someone is looking and how long they maintain eye contact. Too little eye contact signals discomfort, dishonesty, or lack of confidence. Too much eye contact without breaks feels aggressive or threatening. The right amount and pattern of eye contact communicates confidence, engagement, and trustworthiness. In Western cultures, the baseline for trustworthy eye contact during conversations is maintaining eye contact for roughly 60 to 70% of the interaction when you're listening, and about 40 to 50% when you're speaking. When listening, sustained eye contact shows you're paying attention and genuinely interested. When speaking, you naturally look away periodically as you think and formulate thoughts, but you return to eye contact to check for understanding and connection. Breaking eye contact by looking down tends to signal submission or discomfort. Breaking eye contact by looking to the side signals thinking or processing. Breaking eye contact by looking up can signal either thinking or dismissiveness, depending on context. Being aware of these patterns in your own eye contact gives you control over the message you're sending. But eye contact isn't universal. Different cultures have different norms, and what signals confidence in one culture might signal disrespect in another. In many Asian cultures, sustained direct eye contact with someone of higher status is considered disrespectful, while in Middle Eastern cultures, very direct eye contact is the norm, and anything less might signal dishonesty. Know your audience and adjust accordingly. But within most Western business and social contexts, the 60-40 guideline serves you well. Posture communicates even when you're not moving. How you hold your body when standing or sitting sends instant signals about confidence, openness, and status. Upright posture with shoulders back communicates confidence and engagement. Slouched posture communicates low energy or defeat. Leaning forward slightly when someone is talking signals interest and engagement. Leaning back signals evaluation or judgment. Crossed arms create a barrier that suggests defensiveness or closed-mindedness, even when that's not your intent. The key with posture isn't to force yourself into rigid power poses that feel unnatural. It's to notice your default patterns and understand what they're communicating. If you habitually cross your arms when listening because it's comfortable, you're unintentionally signaling closed-mindedness to everyone you talk to. If you tend to slouch when sitting, you're signaling less confidence than you might actually feel. Small adjustments to bring your posture more in line with what you want to communicate make significant differences in how people respond to you. Hand gestures add emphasis and credibility to your words when used naturally, but they can also distract or undermine your message when used unconsciously. Research shows that people who gesture while speaking are perceived as more confident, more engaging, and more trustworthy than people who keep their hands completely still. But nervous, repetitive gestures like fidgeting, playing with objects, or touching your face create the opposite impression, signaling anxiety and lack of confidence. The most effective gestures are open, purposeful, and congruent with what you're saying. Using your hands to illustrate size, direction, or contrast makes your words more vivid and memorable. Keeping your palms visible and gesturing with open hands rather than pointing creates a sense of honesty and openness. Steepling your fingers or holding your hands still with palms facing each other creates an impression of thoughtfulness and control. What you want to avoid are self-soothing gestures that signal discomfort. Touching your face, rubbing your neck, playing with your hair. These all communicate that you're nervous or unsure, even if your words are confident. Fidgeting with pens, tapping your feet, drumming your fingers. These create visual and auditory distractions that pull attention away from your message and signal that you're anxious or impatient. Facial expressions are perhaps the most complex element of nonverbal communication because they're partially under conscious control but largely automatic. Your face reveals your emotional state whether you want it to or not, and people read those expressions at an unconscious level that informs their trust and comfort with you. The most important facial expression for building trust is the genuine smile, which involves not just the mouth, but the muscles around the eyes. A genuine smile, what researchers call a Duchenne smile, creates small wrinkles at the corners of the eyes and communicates real warmth and positive emotion. A forced or fake smile involves only the mouth and can actually decrease trust because people unconsciously detect the incongruence between the smile and the lack of corresponding eye engagement. But smiling constantly or inappropriately also undermines credibility. If you smile while discussing serious topics or while the other person is sharing difficult emotions, your smile communicates that you're not taking the situation seriously or that you're uncomfortable. The key is congruence between your expression and the emotional content of the moment. Warmth and openness when appropriate. Seriousness and concern when called for. Genuine emotion that matches the context rather than a fixed expression regardless of what's happening. Voice is technically nonverbal communication, even though it carries verbal content, because how you say something matters as much as what you say. Tone, pitch, volume, pace, and the presence or absence of vocal fillers like and all communicate confidence, authority, warmth, or their opposites. Lower pitch generally communicates more authority and confidence than higher pitch, which is why people unconsciously lower their pitch when they want to be taken seriously. Speaking slightly more slowly than your natural pace communicates confidence and control, while speaking too quickly can signal nervousness or lack of confidence in what you're saying. Moderate volume that's easily heard but not aggressive communicates confidence, while speaking too softly suggests uncertainty, and speaking too loudly can feel aggressive. Vocal fillers like like, and undermine your message by signaling that you're uncertain or haven't fully thought through what you're saying. Everyone uses some fillers, but excessive use makes you sound less credible and less confident. The solution isn't to panic about fillers, but to become aware of when and how often you use them, and to practice replacing them with brief pauses instead. Silence is more powerful than filler words, and a pause before or after an important point actually emphasizes that point rather than weakening it. One of the most powerful techniques in nonverbal influence is something called mirroring or matching. Humans unconsciously synchronize their body language, gestures, and even breathing patterns with people they feel connected to and comfortable with. This synchronization happens automatically between people who have rapport, and it creates a feedback loop where the matching strengthens the rapport. You can use this consciously by subtly mirroring the body language of the person you're talking to. If they lean forward, you lean forward. If they cross their legs, you cross your legs. If they use hand gestures while talking, you use hand gestures when it's your turn to talk. The key is to do this subtly and with a slight delay, so it doesn't feel like you're mimicking them, which would be obvious and creepy. Done well, mirroring creates an unconscious sense of connection and similarity that makes the person more comfortable with you and more receptive to what you're saying. But mirroring isn't just about copying their posture. You can also mirror their energy level, their speaking pace, their emotional intensity. If someone is speaking quietly and calmly, matching that with your own calm, measured responses creates harmony. If they're energized and animated, matching that energy level makes them feel heard and understood. Mismatching their energy by being overly energetic when they're calm or too subdued when they're animated creates friction, even if your words are perfect. Once you've established rapport through mirroring, you can actually lead their state by gradually shifting your own body language and having them follow you unconsciously. If someone is closed off and defensive, you might start by matching their closed posture. Then gradually open your own posture, and often they'll unconsciously open theirs as well because the rapport you created makes them inclined to follow your lead. Physical proximity also communicates volumes about relationship, status, and comfort. Different cultures have different norms for personal space. But in general, standing too close creates discomfort and can feel aggressive, while standing too far communicates coldness or disconnection. For most Western professional contexts, 3 to 5 feet of distance during conversations feels comfortable and appropriate. Closer than 3 feet enters personal space and should only be used when there's already established trust and comfort. Further than 5 feet feels formal and distant. Touch is the most powerful and most dangerous element of nonverbal communication. Appropriate touch, like a handshake or a brief touch on the shoulder or arm, can dramatically increase liking and trust when done in the right context. Studies show that waiters who briefly touch customers on the shoulder get higher tips, and salespeople who shake hands at the beginning and end of interactions are more likely to close deals than those who don't. But inappropriate touch, whether because of context, duration, location, or the relationship between the people involved, destroys trust instantly and can create serious problems. The key is to be extremely conscious of cultural norms, gender dynamics, power relationships, and individual comfort levels. When in doubt, err on the side of less touch rather than more, but don't eliminate touch entirely if it's culturally appropriate. Because appropriate touch builds connection in ways that words alone cannot. The ultimate goal with nonverbal communication isn't to become a performer who perfectly executes every gesture and expression. The goal is to become conscious of what you're already communicating so you can align your physical presence with your intentions. Pay attention to your patterns. Notice when you cross your arms or avoid eye contact or use vocal fillers. Become aware of the nonverbal signals other people send and what those signals reveal about their emotional state and openness. For the next week, focus on one element of nonverbal communication at a time. Start with eye contact, noticing your patterns and consciously maintaining appropriate connection. Then move to posture, then to gestures, then to voice. As each element becomes more conscious and controlled, you'll find that your presence becomes more powerful and people respond to you with more trust and openness, even when your words haven't changed at all. Remember, people make trust decisions in seconds based on signals you're sending unconsciously. Take control of those signals, and you take control of the first and most important step in influencing anyone. Chapter 9. Combining Techniques, Advanced Influence. Masters don't use one technique. They layer them invisibly. Everything you've learned so far, understanding resistance, disarming defenses, asking strategic questions, creating choice architecture, planting seeds, reframing situations, controlling environment, and aligning nonverbal communication. These aren't meant to be used in isolation. The real power comes from combining them seamlessly in ways that feel completely natural while guiding outcomes with precision that seems almost effortless. This is the difference between someone who knows influence techniques intellectually and someone who has internalized them to the point where they become automatic. The amateur uses one technique at a time, often clumsily, and people can tell something is off even if they can't articulate what. The master weaves multiple techniques together so smoothly that the influence is completely invisible, and people walk away feeling like they made brilliant decisions entirely on their own. This chapter is about developing that level of integration by walking through real scenarios and seeing how techniques combine to create outcomes that would be impossible using any single approach. Once you see the patterns of how these elements work together, you'll start recognizing opportunities to layer techniques in your own conversations in ways that feel natural while dramatically increasing your effectiveness. Let's start with a workplace scenario that many people face. You're a manager, and you need one of your team members, let's call her Sarah, to take on a challenging project that will require significant extra effort over the next 2 months. You believe this project will be great for her career development. But you also know she's already busy and might resist taking on more work. If you just assign the project to her directly, you'll likely get either passive resistance, where she agrees but doesn't give her best effort, or active resistance, where she pushes back and you end up in a conflict that damages your relationship. Instead, you use a layered approach. First, you control the environment by choosing when and where to have the conversation. You schedule it for mid-morning when Sarah's energy is good, in a casual conference room rather than your office, so she doesn't feel like she's being called to the principal's office. You bring coffee for both of you, creating comfort and a sense of collaboration rather than hierarchy. You start with disarming language that explicitly respects her autonomy. Sarah, I want to run something by you and get your thoughts. There's absolutely no pressure to say yes right now. I'm genuinely interested in your perspective on this. This immediately lowers her defensive barriers because you've made it clear you're not demanding anything. Then you use strategic questions to understand her current situation and goals. How's your workload feeling right now? What projects are you most energized by? Where do you see yourself wanting to develop over the next year? You're not pitching the project yet. You're gathering information about her mental state, her capacity, and her aspirations. And critically, you're demonstrating that you care about her perspective, which builds trust and receptivity. Based on her answers, you start planting seeds about the project without actually proposing anything. That's interesting. I've been thinking about how we might create more opportunities for people to develop strategic thinking skills, since that seems to be what you're interested in. I wonder what that would look like. You're introducing the concept in a way that connects to her stated goals, but you're not asking her to commit to anything yet. You're just making the idea familiar. Then you shift to reframing the project in terms that align with what she's told you she values. Instead of, I need someone to handle this difficult project, you frame it as, there's an opportunity coming up that would put someone in direct contact with senior leadership and require the kind of strategic problem-solving you were just talking about wanting more of. Now you use choice architecture. Instead of asking, would you be interested in this project? Which allows for a simple no, you might ask. There are a couple of ways this could be structured, depending on who takes it on. Would you be interested in hearing about the options? Or would you rather, I look for someone else for this? You're giving her a choice. But both options involve her engaging with the idea rather than rejecting it outright. As she starts showing interest, you use your nonverbal communication to reinforce the message. You lean forward slightly, showing genuine enthusiasm for her potential involvement. You maintain warm eye contact and use open hand gestures. Your tone is encouraging, but not pressuring. Everything about your physical presence communicates that you believe she's capable of this and that you'd be excited to see her succeed with it. But you're not attached to forcing her to say yes. Throughout the conversation, you're mirroring her body language when she's receptive and gradually shifting to more open, confident postures that she unconsciously starts to mirror back. When she expresses concerns, you don't defend or dismiss them. You validate them completely. That's a legitimate concern. I'd be thinking about that too. Then you ask a question that helps her think through solutions. What would need to be true for that not to be a problem? What kind of support would make that manageable? By the end of the conversation, Sarah feels like she discovered this opportunity herself with your help, rather than feeling like you assigned something to her. She's thought through the challenges and solutions with your guidance through questions, rather than being handed a project with all the decisions already made. She commits with genuine enthusiasm rather than reluctant compliance. And she'll approach the project with full ownership because, as far as she can tell, she chose it after careful consideration. That's layered influence. Every technique supported every other technique, and none of them were obvious or felt manipulative because they were all genuinely oriented toward helping Sarah make a good decision while guiding her toward an outcome that served everyone. Let's look at another scenario from a different context. You're trying to get your spouse to agree to a major purchase, let's say a new car, that you think makes sense financially and practically, but that they're hesitant about because of the cost and because change feels risky. The amateur approach would be to list all the logical reasons why this car makes sense and argue with every objection your spouse raises. This approach almost guarantees either that they'll dig in and refuse, or that they'll reluctantly agree, but resent the decision and blame you if anything goes wrong. The layered approach starts much earlier. Weeks before you're ready to have a serious conversation, you start planting seeds. You mention casually that you read something about the benefits of fuel-efficient vehicles. You point out someone's nice car in a parking lot that happens to be similar to what you're interested in. You have a conversation with friends where someone mentions a positive experience with the dealership or the brand you're considering, making sure your spouse overhears. None of these mentions feels like you're building a case. They're just casual observations that make the idea familiar. When you're ready for the actual conversation, you control the timing and environment. You don't bring it up when your spouse is stressed or tired. You wait for a relaxed moment, maybe during a weekend morning when you're both rested and unhurried. You might bring it up during a walk rather than sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, because walking side by side creates a sense of partnership rather than opposition. You start not with your conclusion, but with strategic questions. Have you noticed that our car has been having more problems lately? What do you think about the maintenance costs we've been seeing? You're getting them to articulate the problem themselves rather than telling them there's a problem. Once they've said it, it's their observation, not your imposition. Then you use reframing to shift how the decision is perceived. Instead of framing it as spending a lot of money on a new car, you frame it as investing in reliable transportation that will actually save us money over the next few years compared to the maintenance and repairs we're facing with the current car. Same decision, different frame, completely different emotional response. You create choice architecture by presenting options rather than a single proposal. I've been thinking about our transportation situation, and it seems like we have a few options. We could keep the current car and budget for increasing repairs. We could look into a reliable used car, or we could consider a new car that comes with warranty coverage. What makes sense to you? Now, instead of defending your position against their resistance, you've created a situation where you're collaboratively evaluating options, and the option you prefer looks reasonable compared to alternatives you've framed carefully. Throughout the conversation, your nonverbal communication is crucial. You stay calm and open rather than tense and insistent. You mirror their energy level and emotional state. If they're concerned, you match that concern rather than trying to override it with enthusiasm. You validate every worry they raise. I completely understand why you'd think about it that way. That's exactly what I was wrestling with too. When they raise objections, you don't argue. You ask questions. What would make this feel less risky to you? What information would help you feel more comfortable with this decision? You're inviting them to solve the problem with you rather than defending a position against them. You might even use seed planting in the moment. I'm not saying we need to decide this today. Maybe it makes sense to just start looking casually and see what options are actually available, without any commitment to anything. Now you've moved them from resisting a big decision to agreeing to a small, low-commitment step that will naturally lead to more engagement with the idea. Over the next few weeks, as you continue the process, every technique continues to work together. You're planting more seeds through casual observations. You're controlling the environment by visiting dealerships at times when they're not crowded and stressful. You're using questions to guide their thinking toward the conclusion you want, without ever telling them what to think. You're reframing every concern in ways that make solutions obvious. And your nonverbal communication consistently signals that you're partners in this decision, not opponents. By the time the decision is made, your spouse feels like they arrived at the conclusion carefully and independently, with your support but not your pressure. They'll be fully committed to the decision because they own it. And if any buyer's remorse appears, they won't be able to blame you because they remember the decision as theirs. One more scenario to illustrate advanced technique layering. You're in sales and you need to close a deal with a client who's interested but hesitant, comparing your offering to competitors and worried about making the wrong choice. Instead of pushing harder with more features and benefits, which would trigger resistance, you use a completely different approach. You start by disarming through radical honesty. I want to be completely transparent with you. This solution isn't right for everyone. And if it's not right for you, I'd rather you know that now than have you commit to something that doesn't serve your needs. This immediately disarms their defenses because you're not pushing. You're doing the opposite, which creates psychological intrigue and makes them more curious about why you're so confident that you're willing to risk losing the sale. Then you use questions to understand not just their stated needs, but their underlying decision-making process and concerns. What does success look like for you with this kind of solution? What would make this decision feel obvious and easy? What concerns keep you up at night about making the wrong choice? You're not just gathering information to pitch better. You're helping them clarify their own thinking, which builds trust and positions you as an advisor rather than a salesperson. And you're learning exactly what frame will make sense to them based on how they think and what they value. You plant seeds about concepts that matter to your solution without explicitly connecting them to your pitch yet. One thing I've noticed across the industry is that the companies who succeed long-term are the ones who prioritize X over Y. You're introducing a mental framework that happens to favor your offering, but you're doing it as industry insight rather than sales positioning. You create choice architecture by presenting your offering alongside alternatives in ways that make your solution look obviously superior without having to directly claim superiority. Some companies go with the low-cost option because upfront price is their main concern. Others go with the premium option because they've calculated the long-term ROI. Based on what you've told me, which approach aligns better with how you evaluate these decisions? You control the environment by how you structure the sales process. Instead of pushing for a decision in a high-pressure presentation, you might suggest meeting somewhere casual where they feel comfortable. You might invite them to talk to current customers rather than just hearing your pitch. Because social proof from peers is far more powerful than anything you can say. Your nonverbal communication throughout is relaxed and confident, never desperate or pushy. You're comfortable with silence when they're thinking, rather than filling it with more talking. You mirror their communication style and energy, creating unconscious rapport that makes them trust you more. When they express objections or concerns, you validate them completely and then reframe. That's a really important consideration. What I'm hearing is that you want to make sure you're getting value for the investment. Can I share how our other clients have thought about that calculation? By the end of the process, the client feels like they made a careful, well-considered decision with your guidance, but without your pressure. They trust you because you never pushed, never manipulated, never made them feel like you were trying to sell them something they didn't need. They'll become advocates for you because they feel like you helped them make a great decision rather than convincing them to buy something. In all three scenarios, notice the common patterns. You never argue or push. You always start by lowering defenses and building trust. You use questions to guide thinking rather than statements to persuade. You create frames and architectures that make the desired outcome obvious. You control environmental factors to support the conversation. And your nonverbal communication consistently reinforces the message that you're collaborating toward a mutual goal, rather than opposing their resistance. This is what mastery looks like. It's not about perfecting individual techniques. It's about seamlessly combining them in ways that feel completely natural, while achieving outcomes that seem almost magical to observers who don't understand what's happening beneath the surface. Conclusion. You now understand what most people will never learn about influence. You know that trying to convince people with facts and logic activates their psychological defense systems and creates exactly the resistance you're trying to overcome. You understand that the brain doesn't process information objectively, but through frames and contexts that shape everything about how that information gets interpreted. You've learned that influence isn't about winning arguments, but about guiding thinking so invisibly that people believe they arrived at conclusions independently. Most importantly, you've learned specific, practical techniques that you can start using immediately to transform every important conversation you have. You know how to disarm defensive reactions before they start. You know how to ask questions that guide thinking toward specific conclusions without telling people what to think. You know how to create choice architectures that make desired decisions feel obvious and natural. You know how to plant seeds that grow into fully formed ideas people believe are their own. You know how to reframe any situation to highlight aspects that support productive thinking. You know how to control environmental factors that shape decisions as much as words do. And you know how to align your nonverbal communication so your physical presence reinforces your message instead of undermining it. These aren't theory or philosophy. These are tools that work in the real world, in every context where you need to influence thinking or behavior. In business negotiations, in leadership situations, in parenting conversations, in romantic relationships, in sales interactions. In any moment where you want someone to see something differently or make a different choice than they're currently inclined toward. But knowledge alone changes nothing. You can understand every principle in this book intellectually and still continue using the same ineffective patterns you've always used if you don't commit to actually changing your approach. The difference between people who read books like this and nod along and people who actually transform their influence in the world comes down to one thing: consistent application. For the next 30 days, I want you to commit to applying these techniques deliberately in your daily interactions. Not in every conversation, because that would be exhausting and artificial, but in the moments that matter. When you catch yourself about to try to convince someone of something, pause. Remember what you've learned. Choose a different approach. Instead of presenting your argument, ask a question. Instead of building a logical case, plant a seed. Instead of pushing harder when you meet resistance, disarm first and validate their concerns. Pay attention to what happens when you stop trying to win arguments and start guiding thinking. Notice how people respond differently when they don't feel pressured or controlled. Watch how much more receptive they become when you respect their autonomy and create space for them to think rather than overwhelming them with your certainty. Observe how ideas you plant casually take root and grow into decisions people champion weeks later, having completely forgotten that you introduced the concept in the first place. Some of these techniques will feel awkward at first, especially if you're used to being direct and forceful in your communication. You might feel like you're being too subtle or indirect, like you're wasting time when you could just tell people what you think they should do. Resist that impulse. The directness you're comfortable with is exactly what's been creating resistance and limiting your influence all these years. The subtlety and patience required for invisible influence might feel uncomfortable initially, but the results will speak for themselves. You'll know you're making progress when people start seeking your input and advice instead of defensively resisting it. when they credit you with helping them think through difficult decisions rather than trying to convince them of predetermined conclusions, when they walk away from conversations feeling empowered and capable rather than controlled and pressured, when you find yourself influencing outcomes without ever having to argue or push or create conflict. This is what real influence looks like. Not domination, not manipulation, not winning debates through force of argument, but gentle, invisible guidance that helps people discover better answers while feeling completely autonomous the entire time. It's more work than just telling people what to do, yes, but it's also infinitely more effective and infinitely more sustainable because it builds trust and cooperation instead of resentment and resistance. One final thought about the ethics of these techniques. Because if you're someone who thinks carefully about right and wrong, you might be wrestling with whether it's appropriate to use approaches that guide people's thinking without them being fully conscious of what's happening. Let me be clear about this. There's nothing inherently unethical about understanding how human psychology works and using that understanding to communicate more effectively. Every advertisement you see, every well-designed product you use, every compelling speaker you've ever listened to is using these principles, whether they've studied them formally or not. The techniques exist, and they work regardless of whether you choose to use them consciously. The question isn't whether you'll be influenced by these principles or influence others through them. The question is whether you'll do so intentionally and thoughtfully or unconsciously and haphazardly. What makes influence ethical or unethical isn't the techniques themselves, but the intentions behind them and the outcomes they produce. If you're using these approaches to guide people toward decisions that genuinely serve their interests, to help them overcome their own psychological barriers to making good choices, to create outcomes that benefit everyone involved, then you're using influence ethically. You're helping people make better decisions than they would make if left to their own biases and defense mechanisms. But if you're using these techniques to trick people into decisions that serve you at their expense, to exploit their psychological vulnerabilities for your gain, regardless of the cost to them, to create situations where you win and they lose, then you've crossed into manipulation and exploitation. And beyond the moral problems with that approach, it's also strategically stupid because once people realize they've been manipulated, they'll never trust you again, and your influence will be permanently destroyed. The line between ethical influence and manipulation comes down to whether you'd be comfortable with the other person knowing exactly what you're doing and why. If you'd be embarrassed or defensive if they understood your approach, that's a signal that something isn't right. But if you'd be happy to explain your reasoning and confident that they'd appreciate your thoughtfulness in how you communicated with them, then you're probably on solid ground. So use these tools wisely. Use them generously. Use them to make the people around you better off, not just to get what you want from them. Use them to create win-win situations where everyone walks away feeling good about the outcome. Use them to build trust and cooperation rather than to extract compliance through clever psychological tricks. The world has enough people trying to force their will on others through argument and pressure and dominance. What it needs is more people who understand how to guide thinking gently, who know how to help others discover their own best answers, who can influence outcomes while strengthening relationships instead of damaging them. You can be that person. You have the knowledge now. You have the techniques. What you do with them over the next weeks and months and years will determine not just how effective you are at getting what you want, but what kind of leader, partner, parent, colleague, and human being you become. Stop convincing. Start guiding. The transformation begins now.